Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. So, you guys may remember not too long ago, just a couple weeks back, I did a video about kind of revisiting the Masters of Horror series that was on Showtime back in 2007 or whatever it was. There was 2 seasons of it, and it was good. Like, the quality was kind of like, you know what I mean. But some of them were fantastic. A lot of them were really good. A couple of them were kind of sucky. But overall, it was like a really, really good, iconic series. Now, not too long after I did that video, I got a message from a friend of mine, and he reminded me of something that for some reason I had completely and totally forgotten about. That there was technically a third season of Masters of Horror after a fashion, like kind of. So, evidently, what happened after the success of the Showtime series, Masters of Horror, NBC, the network, apparently approached the series creator, Mick Garris, and asked him to kind of like adapt the same concept into a horror series that would be on network television on NBC, like in the Thursday night, like 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slot. So the name of the show was actually not Masters of Horror, but it was called Fear Itself. But it was essentially the same idea. Like each episode would be kind of like a standalone, roughly 45-minute movie, and each of them would be written and or directed by a different like horror, like a well-known horror person. You know what I mean? Either whatever. Now I gotta say that though Fear Itself didn't really pull nearly the same kind of dazzling array of talent that they had on Masters of Horror, there were some, very well-known, like very esteemed directors from the initial run of Masters of Horror who returned. You got Brad Anderson, you got John Landis, you got Stuart Gordon, Ernest Dickerson, and Rob Schmidt were those that returned. Also, Fear Itself kind of featured some movies by sort of celebrated horror directors that hadn't participated in the original Showtime series. You got like Ronny Yu, Mary Harron, Larry Fessenden, and also had like a lot of really good actors, some of them before they got super, super famous. So that was like really cool as well. Now, of course, being on network TV was going to sort of defang the concept somewhat, I guess, because everything would have to be toned down to like PG-13, even though they were showing it like fairly late at night. But in my opinion, I don't think this really affected like the overall quality of most of the episodes. And matter of fact, quite the contrary. I kind of feel like even though some of the episodes you could tell that they were definitely kind of like pulling their punches by, kind of showing some things off screen that maybe like the Showtime series would have showed in all its glory. I was actually surprised Fear Itself got away with a bit more gore and a bit more like darker subject matter than I probably would have expected, like given that it was on network TV. So the series started its very brief run in early June of 2008. And although NBC ordered 13 episodes and 13 episodes were produced, only 8 of them were ever broadcast. Like they showed the first 8, and then the network had to preempt the show for the 2008 Summer Olympics. And they were basically like, yeah, the show will be back after the Olympics are over. But it never came back on, and they didn't really say what was going on with it. Like, NBC didn't even officially announce that we canceled it until, like, 6 months later, 8 months later, something like that. It was like March or something of like 2009 that they finally announced, oh yeah, by the way, like we canceled it. So there were like 5 episodes that never got showed. So the same year, 2009, they actually released the entire series like as a DVD set. And that included the 5 episodes that they had never shown on TV. But I have to say that as of this recording, at least in the United States, Fear Itself is very, very easy to stream for free. It's available for free on YouTube, on Vudu, on Plex, and on the Roku channel. So you can watch it pretty much anywhere. I watched it on YouTube and it said free with ads, but it actually didn't show me any ads. So I was like, okay, whatever, I'm fine with that. So although I think like on my Masters of Horror breakdown, I kind of skipped around some. Like I was sort of like talking about the episodes in the order of how I liked them, like my preference from best to worst generally. But I think this time around, like just to avoid confusion and to like keep my fucking opinions straight and everything, I think I'm going to talk about the Fear Itself episodes in the order that they're listed on the show's Wikipedia page, which is how they were initially broadcast on TV. Even the ones that weren't broadcast, like they were the ones, that's how they were supposed to be broadcast, that order. I mean, not that it matters all that much, but the order that the episodes aired in on NBC isn't the same as the order that they're on the DVD or on streaming services, because this order that I'm doing them in is not actually the order that I watched them in, because they just, I don't know why they did that, but whatever. Because, I mean, it doesn't really matter one way or the other, because each episode is its own thing, like it's its own mini movie, so you don't have to watch them in order because they don't have anything to do with one another. So I don't really understand why they changed the order around, but whatever. So let's dive right into this. So the first one is called The Sacrifice, and I think that this one is maybe, because I don't think I saw this show during its original run, but I think I maybe saw this one, because when I watched it, this was the only one that seemed at all like vaguely familiar to me. The rest of them I did not remember, so I don't think, so probably I caught this one and then just like forgot about the show and didn't watch any of the other ones, but this one did seem a little bit familiar. So this is called The Sacrifice, and it was directed by Breck Eisner, who is actually the son of the former Disney, head honcho guy, Michael Eisner, probably best known to horror fans. Like, he's directed some other things, but I think he's probably best known for directing the 2010 remake of the George Romero movie, The Crazies. That's kind of the only thing of his that I'd seen. And this was actually co-written by Mick Garris and by a guy named Del Howinson, who's a novelist. And this is actually adapted from Del Howinson's short story, which is called The Lost Herd. So The Sacrifice, this was like a decent enough way to kick off the series, I guess. It was nothing special, to be honest, but it was good enough to give you hope that like the subsequent ones will be like, oh, that was pretty good. Like, maybe the next ones will be even better. You know what I mean? I mean, the thing about it is that I guess in 2008, like it's, the landscape has changed a lot now, but back in 2008, I kind of feel like horror on TV, like on network TV, was a harder sell. Like this was before Walking Dead. I guess that's cable. That's not really network TV. But you know what I mean? It was just like, I feel like it was kind of like a harder sell. And you can tell that sort of the suits that are in charge of programming were kind of trying to hedge their bets a little bit with this, with the episode that they picked to be like the inaugural one. Because they're like, well, we want a story that's interesting enough that's going to pull in horror fans, but not so extreme or graphic that it's going to turn off like a casual viewer. You know what I mean? So they were just trying to like hit that middle. And I think they kind of did on this one. I mean, this one, it's pretty gruesome, I mean, for network TV, but it was good enough that like horror fans would be like, yeah, I could get into that. And probably like casual people like, yeah, that was pretty good too. So it was probably like a good choice. So the story begins kind of just like in the middle of things. There's a group of 4 guys and they're in a car and they're obviously fleeing from some prior event, which you're imagining is like some crime because they all seem kind of shady. One of the guys, whose name is Navarro, is wounded. They try to make it seem like, oh, we were canoeing and he got hit with a branch in the chest, but it's pretty obvious that it's a gunshot. So like I said, you're pretty sure these dudes are criminals of some stripe or another. So the car, while they're escaping, like drives over this big spike in the road and like basically pulls out the whole undercarriage or whatever. That obviously disables the vehicle, and because Navarro is wounded and they need some help, so they start trekking toward this kind of remote settlement they see across the thing. They see like smoke coming out of a chimney from across the water, so they kind of like go over there and get into it. Now when they get there, they find this kind of nearly abandoned compound. Now this was actually filmed at Fort Edmonton Park in Canada, which I think has turned up in like several other, it's kind of, like an old school like wood fort, you know what I mean? It's actually like pretty cool looking. So that's where they shot it. So they come there and, first red flag is that in the sort of like front courtyard or whatever, there's all these kind of crude grave sites, like all these little crosses like made of sticks and stuff, which you're like, okay, what happened here? That's not good, probably. Now eventually the guys meet the residents of this remote outpost, 3 hot blondes who live with essentially like the Amish. They don't have any electricity, they don't have any running water, and they've apparently never left this compound. There's also another guy there who's called like the preacher or the something like that. You find out later it's the dad. It's not really that important. But yeah, so they live here. All 3 of these are sisters. So the sisters are initially like pretty accommodating. They give the men something to eat, and like they said, oh, we are contend to like Navarro and like try to stitch up his wound or whatever. But it becomes clear pretty early on that something kind of nefarious is going on, and that the sisters are in the service of like some creature that is gonna eat the dudes. So there's that. Now, as I mentioned, this one was kind of middle of the road. The monster design, I have to say, was pretty great. There was some decent gore also. Like I said, some impalements and shit like that. So they didn't really hold back all that much. The story was kind of predictable, though. And none of the guys, like when they get there, the protagonists were all that likable. I mean, they were criminals, so you just like assumed they were, so you're just like, okay, so they're gonna get eaten. Like that's cool. The only one that was even kind of sort of likable was this guy who's kind of like endearingly dorky, who was like the brother of one of the criminals, and you could tell that he just kind of like got brought along on this adventure or whatever. And his name was Lemon. I think it was like a running gag that his name was Lemuel, but they called him Lemon for short. And he's actually played by that guy, Jesse Plemons. Is that how you pronounce his last name? Like, he's been in a bunch of stuff. I think people know him mostly from Friday Night Lights, because that was kind of like his big breakout role. But I actually recognized him from I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Like, he was in that movie adaptation. And he was in Antlers as well, like playing the cop. So that's where I knew him from. But he's been in a fuck ton of stuff also. So like, since the guys were criminals, you didn't really mind all that much, like when the monster started chowing down on them. So I was just like, yeah, whatever, eat them. You know what I mean? But overall, I mean, this was actually like really well shot and very capably directed, and had some really solid acting performances. So, you know, it was like a pretty decent start. So this second episode, Spooked, was also pretty good, though I have to admit that my attention kind of wandered somewhat during the runtime, and I kind of lost track of what was going on, like a little bit toward the end of it. But I mean, I kind of figured it out later, but I was just kind of like, wait, what? You know what I mean? So this was also co-written by Mick Garris, but this time with a guy named Matt Venny, and directed by the fantastic Brad Anderson, who's actually been cemented in the horror pantheon, obviously because of Session 9, and he also did The Machinist with Christian Bale, which is great, which is not exactly a horror movie, because, well, it sort of is, but you know what I mean? He also did one of the better, though more understated episodes from the original Masters of Horror, which was called Sounds Like, the one that was kind of, Twilight Zone-y. So that's that guy. So this, like I said, it's called Spooked, which is kind of like a bland name. They probably could have come up with something better, but whatever. So we're following a shitty cop named Harry Siegel, who's actually played by Eric Roberts. And his big thing is he's a real big might makes right type guy, or the end justifies the means type of guy. You know what I mean? Where, well, I need information, so I'm just going to like beat it out of you, even if you're like an innocent person. So he's just like an abusive tool, and he's apparently been allowed to get away with it for a really long time. Now, at some point at the beginning of the story, he deliberately murders a man that's like suspected of kidnapping a young boy or having information about the kidnapping or whatever. So he does that, and like that's finally like a step too far, and they throw him off the force. So then we jump ahead, I think it's like 15 years later, and he's working as like a private detective. So basically he's spending his days now like recording evidence of people's sleazy extramarital affairs. Like that's how he seems to be doing well for himself, but you know what I mean? That's just kind of what his job is now. So in the course of this line of work, he gets approached by this woman named Meredith, who's played by Cynthia Watros, who was on Lost, among other things. And she wants him to prove, like most of his clients do, that her husband is cheating on her. So she says, well, it so happens that this creepy house that's across the street from mine is abandoned, and that would make a perfect hiding place, like from which to watch hubby's dalliances, his comings and goings, without the hubby, like, being the wiser. So Harry does that. He sets himself up in the abandoned house across the street, but shortly into this gig, he starts seeing things in the house, like in the house that supposedly belongs to Meredith. Like, lights are on, and like he sees people in there like talking, and he has like, you know, the big ear thing where he can hear like the people that are talking in the house across the way, and he hears them talking, but he says to his partner, it's like, hey, we got lights on, or hey, we got people in there, and he's like, bro, what are you talking about? There's nobody in there. Like, you know what I mean? So he's seeing like ghostly shit, essentially. So it kind of slowly starts to dawn on Harry that the voices that he's picking up in his headphones and the people that he's kind of seeing in the windows and stuff are actually people that he's wronged in the past, and that kind of included the man that he murdered, like near the beginning, who actually said, oh, you haven't seen the last of me, or you'll never forget me, or something like that. So he essentially like kind of put a curse on him, I guess. So after that, like the whole story kind of becomes like a kind of supernatural revenge and redemption narrative, and then there's kind of a thing about his past and like an accident that happened with his brother in the past and him like trying to make amends for that. And it's all like this big complicated thing. So gotta say, like, Eric Roberts mostly tones down his usual scene chewing here to the episode's benefit. He's actually like really, really good in this. I like Eric Roberts, you know what I mean? Scene chewing's fine. I also really liked, I think my favorite thing about this episode was that in the abandoned house, there's like this graffiti on the walls of like these little like kind of stick figure kids or something like that, and whatever is going on, like, having to do with like the haunting or whatever, like the graffiti drawings like change, and like sometimes they like move around, like there's like a little one where it goes shit and like cuts its throat and then like blood comes out the wall and stuff like that, and I was like, that was really cool. I really, really liked that imagery. Also, another highlight of this was Larry Gilliard Jr. from The Wire. He actually plays Harry's partner, James, and he's really good. Like, I don't want to say he's like the comic relief. I guess he's kind of like the comic relief, but it's not like overdone, you know what I mean? It's just enough levity to kind of like, for the proceedings. So again, another kind of middling episode, but with enough compelling details and like cool imagery and good acting and stuff like that to absolutely make it worth watching. So this one, I think, was easily one of the best episodes of the series, at least in my opinion. And I liked that it went in some directions that I wasn't really expecting. Like, well, yeah, I'll get into that in a minute. So this was actually written by Daniel Knopf from Carnival. That was probably what he's best known for writing. And directed by Ronny Yu, who did Bride of Chucky and Freddy vs. Jason, among other things. So Family Man is basically like a body swap kind of story with, again, a much bleaker ending than I would have expected from a network series. So I'm like, I'm glad they actually went there. I was like, oh, they went there? All right. So you got Colin Ferguson, who's been in fucking tons of stuff, TV and movies, but I immediately recognized him from the 2006 Lifetime adaptation of the Anne Rivers Siddons novel, The House Next Door, which I did a video about like a while back. And I was like, hey, it's that guy. So in this, though, he plays a guy named Dennis Mahoney. And Dennis Mahoney is one of those guys, he just seems to have everything. He has like the perfect life. He has like a great job. He has a beautiful house. He has a loving wife and 2 adoring children, and everything is just awesome. However, one afternoon, he's involved in this horrific car accident and ends up like pretty much dying on the operating table. Unfortunately for him, there's another man in the hospital named Brodigan, who's played by Clifton Collins Jr., who was in a bunch of stuff too. He was in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. He was in Pacific Rim. He was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So yeah, you'll recognize him because he's instantly recognizable. So Brodigan gets brought into the hospital at the same time, completely like shot full of holes. This guy, it turns out, was a serial killer known as the Family Man, and they called him that because his habit was slaughtering whole entire families. And I think they said like he'd killed like 26 people like before they gunned him down. And he'd started with his own family, like killing his own family when he was just like 12 years old or something like that. So he's a bad guy. So Brodigan and Mahoney both get brought back to life, but their souls have switched bodies. So that means that the innocent Mahoney, obviously, is now behind bars and like awaiting trial for 26 murder counts, while Brodigan is free to take over Mahoney's life. So I think the most interesting thing about this episode is that it didn't really go the more predictable route of having Brodigan like, woo, I'm in a new identity, I can continue my serial killing career or whatever, because he has a new face and a new identity now and he can like blend in better. But the story doesn't do that, which I thought was like really interesting. It goes like in a more intriguing direction, like as far as exploring like psychological kind of shit. Brodigan decides that he actually wants to make a fresh start and essentially live as Mahoney with, the good life and the loving family that he's always felt that he was denied. So I thought that was great. I thought that was like a great, like a more complicated kind of story. And the whole suspense of this setup is generated by the fact that Brodigan is still a serial killer. You know what I mean? And he can't quite manage to like tamp down his murderous impulses. So on his side, you're getting all the suspense with like the family going, bro, what the fuck is the matter with you? You know what I mean? Because you're acting really weird. And then there's also like the horrible, like frustrating suspense of like watching the real Mahoney, who's innocent, inside the serial killer's body and like trying to tell people, hey, I'm not really that guy, and like talking to his lawyer and like, I know everything about this guy and like, please help me get out of here, because it's like, I know this sounds crazy, but we switch bodies like in the emergency room to like, oh my God, how fucking horrible. I know that would never happen in real life, but it's just like, if that did happen to you, that would be like really scary. So I really, really liked the kind of juxtaposition that they did with that. So, I mean, you know, body swapping tales are nothing new. They've been done a lot of times before, but I really, really did like this take on the trope. And I was also really glad to see that the ending wasn't afraid to take things kind of to their like inevitable conclusion, as dark and nihilistic as that was. So I was like, hey man, good on you, NBC. I would have thought they would have tried to like make it a happier ending, but I was like, nope, okay, they went there, awesome. So this one here seems to be one of the worst reviewed episodes of the series, at least according to like IMDb. And although I will say I quite enjoyed it up to a point, it did kind of drag in places like in the middle, and the twist ending, while I didn't see it coming, and like when I saw it, I was just kind of like, oh, haha, that's like a good twist ending. But the more you think about it, the less sense that it makes. So I'm just saying, because like I was like, oh, that was a cool ending, and then I was like 10 minutes later, I was like, wait, no, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, just if you don't think about it, like, it's fun. So this was directed by the legendary John Landis, who obviously needs no introduction to anyone here. And it was written by the Jeepers Creepers creator and noted pedophile, Victor Salva. So this is called In Sickness and in Health, and as you might imagine, because of the title, it takes place entirely on like a single wedding day. So there's a woman named Samantha. She's played by Maggie Lawson from Psych. And she's marrying her boyfriend, Carlos, who's played by James Roday, also of Psych. And she actually hasn't known this guy all that long. I don't remember if they say, like, exactly how long she's known him, like, how long they've been dating, like, before they got married. But it's not, like, it's not very long. And a lot of her friends keep subtly like alluding to it. They're like, we're not, you know, questioning your thing, but don't you think like maybe you should have known him better? It's like, you know, you rushed into it, blah blah blah. But she's like, oh, I love him, and it's like, I knew this is what I wanted, blah blah blah. So while Samantha and the bridesmaids are getting ready for the ceremony, Samantha gets slipped this little note. And it ostensibly came from some mysterious woman wearing a red headscarf who had kind of disappeared, like jumped into a cab or something before the festivities even started. Like it came through like a couple people. Like I think like the woman gave it to the priest, and then the priest gave it to one of the bridesmaids and said, here, like the priest said this woman came and gave this, it's for you and shit like that. So Samantha opens it, and the note simply reads, it's typed in the middle, and it just says, the person you are marrying is a serial killer. So from that point, like the rest of the story plays out the way you would probably expect it to. Like Samantha evidently begins to doubt her decision to marry this person that she knows so little about, she realizes now. And Carlos starts acting in ways that suggest that maybe the note could possibly be true, because he starts like getting more and more aggravated and like more and more dickish, like as the story goes on. And it becomes very clear that Carlos has a secret of some kind. So what is it? Like, you know what I mean? Is it as bad as the note says, or is there something else going on? Is it a misunderstanding, something like that? So now, as I noted earlier, this one has a really big twist ending, which, as I said, is fun, but completely illogical in the context of the story if you go back and watch it again. But this one was nonetheless fairly decent overall. I will say, though, I think it might have worked better if it was shorter, because I kind of felt like a lot of the second act felt kind of padded and kind of like repetitive, where there was just kind of like chases and interactions between her and the husband, or, you know, the boyfriend, the fiance, whatever, where they were just where they're kind of like talking around everything, you know what I mean? So if it was shorter, it probably would have been a lot better. And I liked the twist. I was like, oh, you know, cool. But then like when I thought about it, I was like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me. So this one right here was another one of the best episodes of the series. And this one has the great Elizabeth Moss. I kind of feel like this was before she was massively famous. I mean, she was getting accolades for Mad Men at this point, which, you know, came out, I think Mad Men started in 2007 and this was on in 2008. So she was known, but I mean, now she wasn't like the megastar that she is now. So she's in this playing kind of like a rookie cop, or a boot as they call it, and also a horror geek. So her character's name is Bannerman. Now this one was directed by the late great Stuart Gordon, and was written by the Cemetery Dance editor, Richard Chismar, and actor-screenwriter Jonathan Sheck I think it's Czech, right? He also turns up in the final episode of the series, which is called The Circle, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And this was adapted by a short story by, like, I believe he's a British writer named Peter Crowther. So it's called Eater. And it's the story of, like, this Cajun cannibalistic serial killer who has some massively jacked up teeth. And his name is Dwayne Eater Mellon, because he's a cannibal. This character is terrifyingly played by an actor named Stephen R. Hart, who is nearly 7 feet tall. He's 6'11". I looked it up because I was like, oh my God, are they like shooting him like to make him look that big? No, he actually is that big. He's a fucking enormous dude. So this serial killer is being kind of like transported from one place to another, like by the FBI or whatever, during, I think it's like a snowstorm. And they kind of end up stuck at this little, like, small remote police station. So they have to keep him in a cell there overnight until somebody else can come get him or whatever. So this police station is staffed by only 3 people. Elizabeth Moss character, like I said, whose name is Bannerman. And she's the only woman there. And she has, like, 2 real jerkwad, like, male colleagues who call her Goth Cop because she's into horror, which I thought was, like, super funny. I'm like... Is it wrong? I would totally watch a show called Goth Cop. That's fucking hilarious. But I mean, they just generally act like sexist shit stains. I mean, not only because she's a woman, but also because she's a noob. You know what I mean? So they're always just kind of like, hey, boot, like blah, blah, blah. And like, go make me some coffee or what's, you know, nothing like that. But it's kind of like that. They're just kind of dicks. So over the course of the night, it starts to dawn on Bannerman that there's something decidedly unnatural about this Dwayne Mellon fellow, aside from the fact that he enjoys snacking on people while they're still alive. So her 2 male colleagues start acting like stranger and stranger, like as the night goes on, and Bannerman starts seeing things. And as it goes on, because she's like real into horror and she's maybe like seen this shit before, she starts to become convinced that the serial killer's cannibalistic habits have maybe given him supernatural powers. There's kind of a voodoo angle as well, which is why they made him a Cajun, you know what I mean? I think this might have been my favorite episode overall. I mean, there were a couple like in the running for that, but when I'm kind of thinking about it now, because I watched these over a couple of days, but I think this is the one that stood out the most. The acting is great. It's very, very suspenseful. Way more gore, again, than I would have expected from something shown on network TV, including several like hearts pulled out, and a slice of pizza topped with a gooey eyeball. So there's that. Elizabeth Moss, I love her. She's always wonderful, and she really kind of sold the premise here. Also, like I said, gotta give big props to Stephen R. Hart. It was just like pants shittingly scary as this fucking enormous cannibalistic dude with these fucking teeth. He is so scary. He is great. He needs to be in more things. Like, I looked at his Wikipedia page, and he's been in a lot of stuff, but I kind of feel like, you know, obviously he's going to get typecast into horror because he's so large, but I was reading kind of a review it or something that was talking about him, and they said, you know, he could be like the next generation's, like this generation's Michael Berryman, like, you know what I mean, where he could just parlay that, his size and the way he looks, like into roles like that. I think he's been in little horror stuff, like, but usually he plays monsters and stuff, because what are you gonna do? I mean, he's 7 feet tall, but he's fucking great in this. He's so scary, and he definitely needs to be in more things. Okay, this right here, this was the only episode of the whole series that I really did not care for at all. So this is called New Year's Day. And this was directed by Darren Lynn Bousman, who also did 4 of the Saw movies. I think he did Saw 2, 3, 4, and Spiral, maybe. He also directed Repo, the Genetic Opera, which I actually like. And this was actually written by Steve Niles, you know, probably best known for 30 Days of Night, and the guy, Ben Sokolovsky, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He writes for the CW series, The Flash and Arrow and stuff like that. So the premise of this episode was a little bit disjointed. So I'm not entirely sure what happened. And the thing that I hated most about this was the super, like, over-caffeinated editing. God damn it, I hate that. Well, it's just, and it seemed like a lot of it was padding, too. It's just, like, everything's super fast and, like, it's jiggly and all this. I'm like, fucking stop that. God damn it, I hate that kind of shit. I just feel like that was, like, so 90s and early 2000s. Like, that kind of, like, look at this, is so scary, blah, you know what I mean? And I'm just like, oh my God, cut it out. But I kind of feel like that had run its course by this point, and I was like, we're still doing this, like, in 2008? All right. So it's a little bit disjointed, like I said. from what I could gather, this story is about this young woman named Helen who wakes up like horribly hungover after like a big New Year's Eve party and discovers that in the hours she's been asleep, there's been kind of like a zombie apocalypse. I guess the monsters technically aren't zombies. It's kind of like established that it's zombie-like behavior, but it's caused by some catastrophic leak at like a chemical plant. So I wasn't real clear on whether this is a localized event or whether it's going world. I don't really know. It doesn't really matter. So the story kind of like jumps back and forth from, today, like the present time, where Helen is trying to figure out what's going on and trying to get to the home of her crush, potential boyfriend, something like that. And then like she has this other friend that's in love with her, but she just like friends in him. I don't know. I wasn't really following it. So it kind of flashes between that, and then it kind of like keeps going back and showing flash as she like fills in the blanks of what happened the night before, because like I said, she's hungover and she doesn't remember stuff apparently. So it just keeps jumping back and forth. Honestly, until I read the synopsis of this episode on Wikipedia, I didn't even realize that the ending was a twist ending, because the narrative was so incoherent that, 10, 15 minutes in, I kind of gave up trying to follow it. So like when it got to the end, I was just kind of like, okay. I didn't even realize that was like supposed to be a twist, but whatever. And honestly, like besides that, like zombie apocalypses, that's not really my bag. They've been done to death. So this one kind of had a bunch of strikes against it from the jump, and that editing too, just, made me want to hit myself. So this is actually the only episode out of all of them that I would skip if I was ever doing a rewatch of the series. I just really did not like it. And I kind of feel like, at least from what, there's not a huge amount of reviews of this series because it's kind of forgotten about, but yeah, it seems to be the consensus when I looked after I watched it that this one was kind of like the least favorite, and I can totally see why. Okay, here we go. This is more like it. This is like more like my jam. So this one here, Community, was directed by Mary Harron, who obviously, but most famous probably for doing American Psycho, which is fantastic. She also did the notorious Betty Page. So Community actually comes off a bit like kind of a slightly different take on the Stepford Wives, and it's kind of like satirizing the whole like family values type of crowd, you know what I mean? So you got Bobby and Tracy, and they're kind of like your stereotypical city-dwelling young couple, and they're like, oh, they're thinking about moving out to the suburbs, because they want to start a family in a safer environment and blah, blah, blah. So a friend tells them about this planned community called The Commons. And The Commons is very selective with their residents. Like, you have to, like, this big application that has all these really weird questions on it and shit like that. But if you get in, like, it otherwise seems, like, super perfect. It's like there's no crime. It's, like, excellent schools. It's a very, very close-knit neighborhood. And it's kind of said, like, later on that, if you live here, like, they're going to help you, like, get into the highest echelons of society, like, into, big politics and all this other kind of stuff. So it's that kind of shit. So Bobby and Tracy apply, and they kind of get the spiel about, the woman that sells them the house. She's like, this community, it's like, we have like a really careful balance that we've achieved. We've done research into like thousands of years of what makes communities work. And, how many of these kind of people do you have to have? How many of these kind of people? It's like, we have some people that are single. We have some people that are elderly. We have some people that have kids that are specific ages. So they have it all like down to this like algorithm and like this formula. And it's very, very specific. And they're like, that's why we look for specific people at specific times. So eventually the couple are deemed worthy of the neighborhood, and they get sold this really, really nice, like, big house for far less than they would have expected to pay for it. Now, the other residents are very friendly, but maybe a little bit too friendly, and maybe are a little bit too interested in matters that Bobby and Tracy would probably prefer to keep between themselves. So obviously, this community is all kinds of fucked up, very, very draconian, has a policy of like constant surveillance. Everybody's kind of watching each other, has like a rat culture where everybody's like, supposed to like rat each other out if they do something bad. Has a bunch of like rigid rules about how to behave when you're allowed to reproduce. Like, you have to like have a baby within 6 months or something like of moving there if you said you were going to, blah, blah, blah. And, what ends up happening to people that flout the community's standards. So this episode, while not overtly scary, was actually kind of like low-key unnerving, like in the same way that Stepford Wives is. I mean, I could imagine what a nightmare it would be, like living somewhere with these weird invasive neighbors like dropping by all the time with casseroles and like sticking their noses into your business, like, hey, you guys get pregnant yet, or blah blah blah. Yeah, that would be like horrifying. So you know, again, much like the Stepford Wives, this one also had like a real good satirical bite that worked really well with this whole terror of the suburbs kind of vibe. So yeah, I really liked this one. So this was the last of the Fear Itself episodes that aired on NBC, because remember, like I said, there was the Olympics and then they didn't show the last 5. So this was the last one that aired, and this was actually a great one. So it's called Skin and Bones, and this was directed by Larry Fessenden. And this one had the always awesome Doug Jones in some almighty freaky looking makeup, although it was still like disturbingly human too. This is actually, I mean, people that are into horror, like obviously everybody knows who Doug Jones is, but I mean, he was the Pale Man in Pan's Labyrinth, he's Abe Sapien, he was in The Shape of Water. Like anytime you have like any kind of like skinny creature, it's probably Doug Jones. Like 99% of the time, that's going to be Doug Jones. And he's in this one, and he mostly looks human, but the makeup they did on it was really, really good. I really liked the makeup in this one. So at the beginning of the story, it's established that a rancher named Grady, who's played by Doug Jones, went out in the mountains with a couple of his little cohorts or whatever on, I don't know what they were doing, trapping or something, and has not come back. I think he was gone for like 10 days or something like that, or like a week. Now, his wife, Elena, who's played by Molly Hagan, and his brother, Rowdy, who's played by John Piper Ferguson, the two of them have been having an affair, obviously. It's made pretty clear. But they're, like, really worried about Grady, obviously, because they're like, he's got to be dead out there. I mean, it was like there was a snowstorm, and he's, like, up in the mountains, and he didn't, like, take any of his gear because he was supposed to come back the same day. So they're like, he's got to be dead. Where the fuck is he? So imagine their surprise when the missing rancher comes staggering back onto the property, looking horribly cadaverous, it's Doug Jones, and dehydrated, and he has like really bad frostbite like on his fingers and his ears. So they put the poor man to bed and attempt to nurse him back to health, but it's pretty evident that Grady ain't the same as when he went out on the trip. Turns out, in fact, which you may have guessed, Grady ended up having to resort to cannibalism in order to stay alive up on a mountain. And that, coupled with the rage that he felt, the knowledge of his wife and brother's relationship, and it actually turns out later on that, like, the sons, like, he even knows that his sons aren't really his, that they're his brothers. It kind of caused him to accept the spirit of the Wendigo into himself. So now Grady is possessed of a supernatural hunger, your Wendigo thing, that drives him to try to eat his way through his entire family and staff, and it's lots of fun. I mean, yeah, this was also like a pretty great episode. Doug Jones is fantastic. I always love to see him. And the Wendigo look they gave him was outstanding, especially the teeth. Like, the teeth are so great. And it's like I said, he looks like a person, but just enough monstrousness that it's really like uncanny. Like, it's just like the teeth are just a little bit too big, and then they kind of put like these white kind of contacts later on, like as he gets more and more monstery, and it's like, and he looks so fucking great, and he's got like the tips of his fingers are like black from the frostbite, and it's like he looks super, super cool. Now, some of the gore in this was softened a little bit for TV, like somebody gets shot in the face and it's off screen. Somebody gets like cleavered to the chest and like meat chopped out of them off screen, but they kind of show the result of it. But it's bloody enough to get the job done. Again, more gore than I would have expected from a network show. The plot doesn't have any big twists or anything like that, but it didn't really need them. This was just kind of like a good, straightforward monster story with, like I said, some really rad makeup effects, and Doug Jones doing a really, really creepy like lead performance. He's just so fucking great in this. I love Doug Jones, but yeah, he's really, really good in this. So this one is more comedy than horror, but it's still pretty entertaining. It's called Something with Bite, and this was written by Max Landis, obviously a son of John Landis, and directed by Ernest Dickerson, who's done like a bunch of horror. He did Tales from the Crypt, the Demon Knight movie, which I really like. He did an episode of the original Masters of Horror, The V Word, which I didn't super care for, but that's neither here nor there. So this one stars Wendell Pierce as a veterinarian named Dr. Wilbur Orwell, who gets bitten by a werewolf after a guy hits the said werewolf with his car and like brings it into the clinic because the werewolf is kind of like still alive. So obviously you get bit by a werewolf, you're going to turn into a werewolf yourself. So Dr. Orwell starts turning into a werewolf. Unfortunately for the veterinarian, though, there's also been a series of grisly murders happening around the city that detectives suspect may have been perpetrated by a wild animal or somebody posing as a wild animal. And it also so happens that a couple of Dr. Orwell's employees, and they kind of turn up mangled at some point. So he starts to worry that he might be killing people in his werewolf form without being aware of it. So yeah, this one was actually a hoot. Wendell Pierce, his lead performance was a real highlight. He was like super, super funny. This also, I always like to see this guy, had George Buza. He actually knew him from, he played Santa in A Christmas Horror Story, that really, really good 2015 anthology horror film, which I love. But yeah, he was badass Santa in that one. So he's actually has a minor role in this as like the father of the werewolf, whose name is Michael, which I thought was like super funny. So this episode, it's like not really scary at all, but it's still like a lot of fun and totally worth watching. So episode 10, which is called Chance, this was another one that I felt sort of meh about. It did have some really strong acting in it and a lot of actors that I like, and had kind of an interesting premise, but again, kind of just like middling. So this had Ethan Embry in it, who's been in a fuck ton of stuff. He was in Late Phases. He was in The Devil's Candy, which you haven't seen The Devil's Candy, like please watch it. It's so good. So he plays a guy named Chance, and he's always short of money, it seems. And he's promised his girlfriend that he's going to, because they're like 3 months behind on the rent and they're going to get evicted and all this other kind of stuff. And he's like, I promise this is, I know I've said before that, that I had all these things and I was going to make money and it didn't work out. But he's like, this time for sure, you know what I mean? It'll be fine. So prior to the events of the story, it's established, he was at like a party or a get together or something, and he got to talking to this antique dealer named Walter, who's played by Vondi Curtis Hall, who I know from Daredevil, but he's been in a bunch of stuff too. So he was talking to him about this particular vase that belonged to like a mutual friend of theirs. And the antique dealer, Walter, he says, man, that thing could be worth as much as $45,000. So Chance manages to buy the thing off the friend for $20,000, thinking that he's going to sell it to the antique dealer, obviously for $45,000. But when he takes it to Walter, Walter says, well, now that I'm looking at it more closely, he's like, because, I just saw it from far away before. It's not as valuable as I thought. It's a later copy. So you can only have $5,000 for it. So from this inciting incident, events start spiraling out of control as Chance becomes convinced that Walter and the friend like set him up like to get money out of him, and starts getting more and more desperate to recoup the money that he lost like over this particular night. Now, intertwined with this thing that's going on is a sort of doppelganger story, because it so happens that Chance, for reasons that I'm not super clear on, but maybe have something to do with a weird mirror that's in the antique shop, he has sort of like, I don't want to say like an evil twin, but kind of like an evil twin, who seems to be the one carrying out all the escalating violence, like as the story goes on. Apparently this mirror Chance, I guess, is just kind of like the dark side of Chance's nature, you know what I mean? Like as the events are unfolding and like shit's getting worse and worse. But I wasn't really sure, like barring that, I'm not really sure like what the two aspects of the story necessarily had to do with one another. I just felt like there was a little bit of a disconnect there. But overall, this was another watchable episode. Not a particularly scary one, but I did like all the acting and stuff like that. So this one was another one of my favorites because I love ghost stories. So this is called The Spirit Box, and it was directed by Rob Schmidt. Now, he also did an episode of the original Masters of Horror, which was great, which is called Right to Die. And that had the actor Martin Donovan in it, and Martin Donovan is also in this as well, like in a pretty major role. I love Martin Donovan. He's great in everything. And this also happened to have been written by Joseph Gangemi. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure every time I say his name, I probably pronounce it differently. I apologize for that. I've mentioned him before. He wrote the screenplays for Wind Chill with Emily Blunt and Stonehurst Asylum, which I reviewed, I think, on my other channel. And he also wrote an excellent and horribly underrated novel called Enamorata, which I've talked about on this channel or on my other channel before, and it's really good, and I feel like nobody talks about it. It came out in 2004. But yeah, so he wrote this story as well. So the adorable Anna Kendrick is in this, and she's playing a high school student named Shelby Johnson. It's Halloween night, and her best friend, Becca, who's played by Jessica Parker Kennedy, are really bored, and they decide they're going to liven up the night a little bit by essentially constructing a homemade Ouija board out of an empty pizza box. So it's all fun and games until it appears that a classmate of theirs, Emily D'Angelo, contacts them from beyond the grave and tells them that even though everyone thinks that she committed suicide, she was actually murdered. So from that point, Shelby and Becca undergo like an investigation to get to the bottom of the mystery. And at some point, they figure out who the murderer is and try to prove how this person was involved. And that kind of like places their lives in mortal danger. This one has a twist ending too. And although I totally did not see it coming, I will say that I thought it strained credulity quite a bit, as there were way too many things that would have to have gone a particular way for it to work out like it did. But I don't know. It has like a big twist and then like another little twist too at the end. So maybe that other little twist like mitigates the main. I'm not really entirely sure. But I mean, it's a pretty minor nitpick because like I got to the end and I'm like, oh, that's cool. But I'm like, wait, what? You know what I mean? But I'm like, I don't know if that would have worked out the way you think. But that's okay though. Like I didn't mind. I actually really dug this one. So, you know, I'm just picking on it a little bit. But yeah, I really liked this one a lot. So here's another a little bit of a blah episode. This is called Echoes, and it was directed by Rupert Wainwright, who directed Stigmata from 1999, which actually I quite liked. But he also directed the terrible remake of The Fog, which I can't even remember what year that came out, but it was awful. So the story about this one, it concerns this man named Stephen or Steven or something, who's played by Aaron Stanford, and he's like obsessed with the 1920s, like so much so that he purchases this house from that era, and he kind of like decorates it like in real roaring 20s kind of style, which is cool because I like that kind of stuff too. So Stephen has this close friend named Karen, who's played by Camille Guati. I'm not really sure how you pronounce her last name. And he's apparently like desperately in love with her, but can't quite pull the trigger on starting a romantic relationship with her because he has some kind of like weird anxiety about it. So not too long after moving into this house though, he starts having visions of a woman named Zelda who looks like Karen. I mean, it's the same actress, but in like a blonde wig and a flapper outfit. And her sketchy, possessive criminal of a boyfriend who's like, he's kind of like he's not like a mob assassin, but he just goes and kills people. Like, but he's like muscle, you know what I mean? And his name is Maxwell, and he's played by Eric Balfour. So Stefan starts talking to his shrink about these visions that he's seeing in his house, and he starts undergoing hypnosis, and Stefan starts to believe that he's actually the reincarnation of Maxwell, and that Karen is the reincarnation of Zelda, and the reason that he's having such anxiety about getting into a romantic relationship with her is that he's afraid that the murderous events of the past, because, you know, one of them, like, ended up killing the other one, are kind of, like, threatening to play out again in the present, and he's, like, trying not to reenact it, I guess. I didn't love this one and I didn't hate it. This was another episode that had like a real cool premise, but maybe might have benefited from being a little bit shorter because there was a lot of like repetition and filler in the second act, and it was pretty easy to see how things were going to go, even though there was a slight twist at the end. So like, again, kind of another middling episode. So this last episode was somewhat better, but still just, again, sort of like middle of the road. Now, like Eater, this one was also written by Richard Chismar and Jonathan Sheck, who also stars in this. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I mean, I'm not really sure. I've seen him in a million things. I've just never heard anybody say his name out loud. But this time around, it's a different director. It's Eduardo Rodriguez, who's a Venezuelan director. So the story follows this writer named Brian, who made it big with a very successful horror novel called Bloodthirsty the year before, but he's had writer's block ever since. So his wife, Lisa, who's played by Ashley Scott, is she kind of tricks him a little bit. Like, she's like, oh, we need to go up to their cabin or whatever, like for a romantic weekend getaway or whatever. But really what she did was organized a kind of like intervention kind of. It takes place on Halloween night. She like invited his agent and the publisher and the publisher's wife and stuff like that, like up to the cabin to kind of like convince him to get cracking on the next book because it's already like 6 months behind schedule. So only a few minutes into this little shindig, however, there's a knock at the door, and it's two little girls trick-or-treating. And this is like a callback to a scene in the cold open, which has to do with like witchcraft or some shit. So the cabin is in the middle of nowhere. So the gang are not really quite sure where these kids came from, but the girls hand over this spooky looking book called The Circle, and it purports to have been written by Brian himself, even though he's like, look, I didn't write this and I've never seen it before. Even more sinister than that, though, is the fact that this book seems to foretell what's going to happen over the course of the night, like what people are going to say and everything like that. And it also details this scenario of essentially like a living darkness and a vampire-like infection that's kind of out of Brian's first novel, Bloodthirsty. So it's almost kind of like it's reenacting this book, but it's also like reenacting his first book. So after that, it's kind of like a classic cabin in the woods style narrative with people becoming infected with this living darkness. And there's also kind of like I said, there's a veneer of like witchcraft or black magic. Like you find out like that's what the mechanism was for why this is happening. So again, a decent episode, but nothing really to write home about. So I gotta say, it's kind of a shame that this series didn't even get the dignity of a full season's run. I mean, not all the episodes are good, of course, but there were enough gems in there to make it worthwhile. I mean, had NBC stuck it out long enough to see if it eventually gained an audience, which it probably would have. I mean, horror on television has made enormous strides in the 14 years since Fear itself first came on, and I really do kind of respect this series for maybe like being a little bit ahead of its time a bit, and maybe paving the way for better series to follow in its wake. If you're a fan of the original Masters of Horror series, then I would recommend giving this one a look. I feel like most people have probably forgotten about it. Hell, I had forgotten about it until somebody brought it up to me. But there is enough decent content in here for horror nerds like me to chew on. And although the quality of the episodes was very uneven, the same could be said for Masters of Horror, and they had a lot less restrictions on content. So considering the content restrictions that Fear itself was working under, I think most of the episodes did a really good, like a serviceable to good job. There's no like brilliant episodes, but there were like several good ones and a couple of teetering on great ones. So most of them are absolutely worth watching. So like I said, you can stream this, at least in the US. I'm not sure about other countries or territories, but you can watch it for free on YouTube, Vudu, Plex, Roku, it's everywhere. So it's like really, really easy to see. So, if you're into that kind of thing, then check it out. It is definitely worth watching. So thanks again for dropping by the salon. Remember to like and share the video if you like this content. And remember also to go over to scaresalon.com, where I post like more written content, book reviews, movie reviews, all that kind of stuff. You'll be entertained for hours, I promise. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.